fully connected. And I see in the chat box a lot of people saying hello, and hello to all of you as well. And if my fellow panelists are not checking the chat box, to let you know there's a lot of friendly greetings coming your way. Well, it's nice. We're getting greetings from people from all over the province, east, west, north, south. Oh, even from Vancouver. Wow. Welcome those of you from outside of Ontario. Okay, folks, I think we're going to, I know people are starting to come on, but in the interest of everyone's time, we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'll speak slowly while people are still logging in. So I want to welcome everyone for joining us tonight in these extraordinary times. I think this is a critically important discussion we're going to be having around food security. And before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that Ontario is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and just how grateful I am for the opportunities to learn about stewardship of our land and water, of our two-leggeds and four-leggeds, those with feathers and those with fens, the flora and fauna of this province, how grateful I am to learn how to be stewards from so many Indigenous leaders. And also just to say how important it is, I think, for us to be in solidarity, particularly with Indigenous communities that don't have access to clean drinking water at any time, but especially at a time when we're told to, stay at home and to wash our hands in order to be safe. That I believe everyone in our province and in our country should have access to clean water. And I would add clean, healthy food as well, which is certainly the point of our discussion tonight. And so I was really delighted to put together, I think, a fantastic panel just to talk about rethinking food security, given what we've learned during the COVID-19 crisis and what food security can look like as we emerge from this crisis. And I just want to thank the hundreds of people from across the province who are joining us tonight, and actually across the country. I see some people from outside of Ontario as well. And also those of you who have sent questions in tonight, and I'll be posing your questions to our panelists. Many of you probably know I have a long background in food. I grew up on a farm in rural Western Kansas and moved to Canada for love in the mid-90s, and quickly was told to go to Guelph, Ontario, to the Guelph Organic Conference, and was inspired there to start one of Ontario's first local organic food delivery businesses. I've also run a food production business that was based in Guelph, and have had the opportunity to co-found Local Food Plus with Lori Stahlbrand, who is the partner of Layne Roberts, who's going to be one of our panelists tonight. So I've had a long history in food and farming, and I have tried to be a champion for food and farmers at Queen's Park. And I'm going to be introducing our four panelists shortly, but I also want to just acknowledge that we have a fifth person who's going to be joining us to do a summation at the end, Ralph Martin, who is a professor at the University of Guelph, also was a candidate for the Green Party of Canada in the last federal election in Wellington Halton Hills, and recently published a book that I found really moving called Food Security, From Excess to Enough. And Ralph's going to do a wrap up from what he hears from the panelists and a conclusion at the end of the evening. So Ralph, thank you for joining us, and thank you for taking notes. We've had over 700 people register to be a part of this conversation tonight through Zoom, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So I want to thank all of you for joining us. And with that, I think we should get started to give ourselves plenty of time. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to introduce and ask a panelist a question. Then I'll introduce the next panelist and ask them the same question. So all of our 4 panelists are going to have the same question. Then we're going to move into questions that have come in from the audience. And given the nature, the format of these Zoom webinars, we found that it's easier to manage questions from the ones that we receive ahead of time. And we received way more questions than we'll be able to ask anyway. So I will be posing your questions to select panelists. And then, as I said, Ralph will do a summation at the end of the evening. So our first panelist tonight is somebody who I've known for many years, was one of the first people I met when I moved to Canada back in the 90s. Layne Roberts is a food policy consultant and author. He's a former chair of the Toronto Food Policy Council. He's written many books, far too many books to say tonight, but I'm going to give you the title of 2 of them that have really had an effect on me. And one is Food for Thought, a book that Layne wrote Real Food for Change, a book that Layne wrote in 1999, shortly after I had started my business, my food business in 1996. And just was a book that really shaped my approach to business and my approach to food. And then more recently, in 2014, he wrote a book, Food for City Building. And I think those 2 books, I think, really bookend a lot of Layne's thinking about the food system, not only as a source of change in terms of our economy, our society, and our health, but also our built environment in the cities and the communities we live in. And if you have the opportunity to be on Twitter, you can follow Layne at W Roberts Food. He's very prolific on Twitter and a great source of food information on a day-to-day basis. So Layne, and as I mentioned earlier, Layne is the partner of Lori Stahlbrand, who I founded Local Food Plus with, which was an organization designed to support local sustainable food systems. So Layne, my first question for you is what cracks in Ontario's food system have been exposed by the COVID-19 crisis? Oh, we still have Layne on mute. Now you're good to go, Layne.
Okay, thanks for your introduction. And if you remember back to the 90s when we first became friends, one of the bases that we formed our friendship on was that we both wanted to be positive instead of negative Nellies. And so if you don't mind, before I talk about the weaknesses that have been exposed, I'll talk about 2 strengths that have come through, I think, pretty well. And one is the Ontario Food Terminal, which is a public warehouse, one of the few in North America. And that has meant we've had steady access to food. We have not had a problem in Ontario really with food deserts. We have a problem of people not being able to afford food, but we haven't had many of the problems that are really trouble the United States chronically, partially because of that food terminal. And second, we've had, I think, a pretty stable system based on supply management. So a lot of staple foods are supplied by local farmers and they're right by us. And however things are getting screwed up from a long distance, we've got a local supply of milk and dairy products, chickens and eggs. So those are 2 strong points. The weakest point is, I think, food has never been taken seriously by any government that's been in power. And food has always played second fiddle in every instance, including during COVID. There's a lot of attention to social distancing, which I very much support. But no one is mentioning the second factor, which is the people who are well nourished are the ones most likely not to get COVID, and above all, most likely not to suffer or die from it. And there's a lot of studies that confirm that, but you'll hardly hear a word coming from anywhere about the importance of nutrition. And as a consequence of neglecting this, I believe we've missed a major area where we can build resistance to both this and future problems. But the biggest weakness, of course, is people on low income are totally unable to support themselves in health and support their health through this crisis, because we've got Toronto, for example, is the child poverty capital of Canada, and nothing has been done about this before, and now it's a crisis because it means right in the middle of a huge society-wide crisis, we have a crisis within a crisis. So I would say it's a problem that we have it, and it's a problem that very few politicians or public health officials are addressing.
Great, thanks, Wayne. And you actually have set up our next panelist perfectly. So I'd like to introduce Layne Robertson, who's the Executive Director of the Ontario Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, and who's a strong advocate for fruit and vegetable growers, both provincially at Queen's Park. So Allison's been in my office on more than one occasion, but also federally advocating for fruit and vegetable growers in Ontario. She's the past chair of the Ontario Food Terminal, which Wayne highlighted as one of the success stories here in Ontario. And I know when there was a review of the food terminal, Allison and I bonded over our deep commitment to ensuring the long-term viability of the food terminal. And she's also an advocate for food security in the remote north and food sovereignty nationally. So Allison, I just want to ask you the exact same question, is what cracks in Ontario's food system have been exposed by the COVID-19 crisis?
Well, thank you very much, Mike. Up until this COVID crisis, 2 or 3 months ago, I always started to answer this question with one of the roots of food security issues is that Canadians have never experienced empty shelves en masse. Even during World War II, we were shipping food to Europe. So I agree with Wayne. I think there's been little concern by government and by the public as to where their food comes from, how it's produced, and a real lack of appreciation for the agri-food sector and what it contributes to the economy. So, really therefore, food's not valued, it's taken for granted, and it's just for producers, it's just a race to the bottom. So it seems okay, or people shrug, or probably a lot of people don't even notice that now we get pickles from India or canned peaches from China, that just a few years ago, we were canning peaches in Niagara, and, we had locally pickled pickles. So to me, there's just no robust federal or provincial policies to protect and develop domestic food production. Food security is not seen as a national security issue, I would say, until now. Just 11 weeks ago when this all started, OFEGA and Canadian Federation of Agriculture, we were talking to Chrystia Freeland's office till into the night, and the Prime Minister's office warning them that right now, today, it's a health issue, but hot on the heels of this health issue, it's going to be a food security issue, a crisis. And one, domestic production has to be secure. This is the time to double down on domestic production. And two, they should be under no illusion that regions such as Spain, Italy, California, Florida, could be exporting their product to us this year. I mean, we'll pick on Trump. He didn't even want to share masks with us. Is he going to share food with us? And this really was not on their radar. So that's kind of the high level. So for the fruit and veg sector in Ontario, I won't say it's a flaw. It's more of a reality for horticulture in Canada, in the States, in Europe, is our reliance on temporary foreign workers. And we thankfully made the government realize how important it was after they shut down the borders that we needed these workers. This is manual labor, seasonal jobs in rural locations. And in good and bad times, most Canadians really aren't willing to do these jobs. Even we've got about 3/4 of the workers in, and still we can't seem to get Canadians to fill that quarter. But that's maybe another discussion. Sure. But as far as the flaws being exposed, I think that the lack of awareness and understanding and appreciation for domestic food production by provincial and federal and municipal governments is the biggest flaw as a lobby organization I see. And policies are not in place to create an environment that prioritizes domestic food production. Ag ministers, I'm sure Mike can agree with me on this, provincially, federally, are seen as minor ministers, and ag is a minor ministry. It's not labor, it's not trade. And as a sector, we used to say, if all the fruit and vegetable growers in Ontario stopped producing, would anybody even notice? Because the shelves would always be filled with imports. So, I'm hoping people will notice now. And I'm glad Wayne mentioned the Ontario Food Terminal, because I used to, when I was chair, there would lecture politicians saying, and this was before COVID, if there's another 9/11 and we shut the borders down, there's 4 days supply of produce for the city of Toronto. And as was mentioned, they looked at moving the food terminal, and the politicians, the questions I was asked, well, why can't this just all be digital? Or why does it have to be in Toronto? Or, it was just asinine, but this was all levels of government just had no clue about our system. So to finish up, I would say that I hope we don't waste a crisis here, and that people wake up, the public, and I think the public are ahead of the government, but municipally, provincially, federally, I'm hoping that this is a wake-up call for food security.
Great, Allison. And we didn't plan it this way, but I feel like each one of you is setting up the next speaker perfectly with your comments. So, because somebody who has been spending much of her life waking up the public around local food is Joshna Maharaj, who is a chef, an activist, an author. If you have an opportunity to see her TED Talks, they're well worth your time. I first met Joshna when she was at The Stop, which is an amazing food security organization. I had an opportunity to work with her when she was a chef at the Scarborough Hospital and was bringing local food into our healthcare system, which I don't think anyone thought was possible, and did it. And I like the way that you describe yourself as somebody who is using hospitality, sustainability, or bringing hospitality, sustainability, and social justice to the table.
Yes.
And you have a new book coming out, or has
I do. It's out already.
It is out already.
I will not resist the opportunity for a
Yes.
plug. It is out. I'm delighted. It's called Take Back the Tray. And amazingly, Mike, in week 1, we are on Amazon's bestseller list already.
Oh, congratulations, Joshna.
Thanks.
And
It's
you
very
can follow
exciting.
Joshna on Twitter as well. She's very prolific in
There's lots.
getting her voice out there as well. So thank you for joining us, and please go out and buy her new book, just published, and it sounds like it's already well on its way to being a bestseller. So Joshua, I'm going to ask you the same question I've asked everyone else. Is what cracks in Ontario's food system have been exposed by the COVID-19 crisis?
Okay, thank you so much. This is very delightful to be a part of all of this. Hello to everybody. I've got 2 things that really resonated when I was thinking of answering this question. And to me, it's been really difficult and it's a painful process, but there's also a part of it that I have been really delighted about, right? It's not easy to watch, but essentially we have really seen the industrial food system has really presented itself as not having resilience nor being nimble, right? I believe we've really seen the divide, right? Because one of the things that I really gather in the work that I do is that the average person is really not connected to the fact that there is another system that they can choose, that they're not exclusively tied to national chains, grocery, that the sort of industrial model for their food. And I get irritated because I don't think that enough conversation goes into the other option. A local, organic, small scale, regional food system is in fact extremely resilient. And that has really shown itself, right? In as much as we've seen the cracks of the industrial food system, I think that our farmers and producers and our local on the ground networks have been incredible in how nimble they've been to pivot and build themselves online businesses and, rework ways to sort of keep the access to good food on the ground for people. I believe it has taught us a lot about what is possible and what our local regional food systems are capable of. And that to me has been a bit of a gift. Been a very harsh way to learn this lesson for sure. But it's perhaps the only way that this truth would ever have really floated up to the surface. You know what I mean? And the other piece that I really feel, and as you said, my early years as a chef were spent in the kitchen at the Stop. I'm still a board member at the Stop. And so I see a lot of this through that lens. And one of the things that has really been highlighted is what I believe to be a very dismissive attitude towards any version of a social safety net, right? I spent a lot of time talking to funders, trying to get money. Students, food insecurity had mushroom clouded, and hearing big, you know what I mean? Like giant national corporations say that this wasn't quite the right fit. You know what I mean? And that they just wanted to send all of these hungry students over to the Stop. Right. And I had just had a board meeting at the Stop hearing about how huge chunks of money have come out of the budget because of events that had to be canceled. Yet we are already beyond 200% increase in the number of people walking through the door. Right. And that if it wasn't for lockdown, I feel like I'd have my torches in the street at that point. You know what I mean? It's just the madness of a lot of assumptions about the net that does not exist. Right? Our social safety net is threadbare and full of holes. It is not, before this happened, it was not catching everybody it needed to catch. And now we have this onslaught of people who are hoping to be caught. And it's just not there, right? The resources, we have amazing, wonderful people who are working really hard to pull this off. But we need to really think more about what this plan B looks like, right? This will certainly not be the last time we have to deal with a state of emergency in this province. And we need to, I think Allison said this, we need to take the lessons from this moment, right? And really connect and think about what kind of systems we need to build so that we can more, so we have a plan so we can get through this so it doesn't knock us down completely.
Great, thank you.
Just that stuff.
Just that stuff. Yeah. So one of those farmers who is very nimble and innovative and responds quickly to change is our next panelist, Brent Preston. And his wife Jillian both run the New Farm in Simcoe County, and I had the honor of meeting both of them in my days with Local Food Plus when we were working to connect them with chefs and restaurants and food service institutions and things like that as well. And Brent works with the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario. He's also a former municipal councillor in Clearview Township. And he too has written a book called The New Farm, so named after their farm. But I love the subtitle of the book, Our 10 Years on the Front Lines of the Global Food Revolution. Which probably says a lot about your life, Brent, or at least your career on the farm. And I just want to also note that if any of you have had an opportunity to visit the website Brent has started, Farmers for Climate Solutions, it's well worth giving it a look. And so, Brent, I'm going to ask you the same question I've asked everyone else. What cracks in Ontario's food system have been exposed by the COVID-19 crisis? We still have you on mute, Brent.
Good, sorry. Thank you very much, Mike. I think it's a big disadvantage to go after these three other panelists who are super smart, insightful people. I've had the pleasure of working with all of them in the past, but I think that they covered a lot of what's been exposed. I think we've experienced personally on our farm how dependent Ontario agriculture is on temporary foreign workers. We have for many years employed workers from Mexico, and they arrived a couple of days ago, but it was a real sort of nail biter to get them here. And I think what Wayne was talking about, the importance of nutrition, a huge percentage of the people who are dying of this disease around the world are people with serious diet-related illnesses. And it really shows that our population itself has become really susceptible to this kind of shock, because people just aren't healthy because they're not getting good food. But I think the theme that Jocelyn was talking about, resilience, is really, really important. I think that the COVID crisis has revealed a lot of the places where our food system is not resilient, whether it's dependent on foreign workers, dependence on imports, the lack of nutrition in the system. And I think that we need to, as we move forward with recovery and moving past the crisis, we have to think about how can we make our system more resilient. And I think part of it is absolutely having a more localized food system. Our farm sells more than half of our produce to restaurants. That market is completely gone right now. But because we have a really, really short supply chain that we sell into, it's our farm, a distributor, and the restaurant. We have found it not easy, but we could quickly pivot to go from farm to distributor to consumer through home delivery services or through retail stores. So it's much easier when the food is coming from close by, doesn't have to cross a border, doesn't pass through 8 or 10 different hands, to be nimble and to respond to this kind of crisis. But I think it's also really important to remember that, and I know that we're going to be talking about this tonight, that there's a much larger crisis looming on the horizon. And whereas COVID is hopefully going to be relatively short timeline, we're talking about maybe a year or 18 months or 2 years. It's primarily been a shock to our health system and to our economic system. But the climate crisis is going to play out over a much, much longer time period and going to have all of the same kind of effects that COVID has had, plus meteorological shocks, weather shocks. When we're talking to our produce managers in the retail stores that we sell to, we grow a lot of salad on our farm, and they said we're having a really tough time getting salad right now, not because of a border closing or because anything to do with COVID, but because there's an ongoing drought in California that is threatening the supply of all kinds of fruits and vegetables. So even while this huge health crisis is playing out, the climate crisis is having a bigger impact on our access to some foods than the COVID crisis is. So we can't respond to COVID by reinforcing and entrenching the food system that we have now. We need to use this as an opportunity to make a much, much more resilient food system, especially one that's resilient in the face of climate change.
Great, thanks, Brent. And so I think I'm going to go into our audience questions now, and I'm going to do this in reverse order. I'm just looking at the questions and thinking how I want to do this. I'm going to start with you, Brent, since I already have you on anyway. And you touched on this a little bit in your opening, but the question is, why are small food producers forced to follow the same rules as corporate farms? Quebec has different standards for small and large food producers, so why can't Ontario?
That's a great question. We're a big fan of food safety regulations. I think that there needs to be strong government oversight and strong regulations for all food producers, everybody in the food system, to ensure that we have a really safe and healthy food system. That said, there are a lot of instances where food regulations are used as to create barriers to entry for smaller producers or smaller processors. So there are rules that are created in consultation between industry and government that really favor the really big, especially the big food processors who have the resources to comply to those regulations. I think this is really, really important in the area of meat and meat processing. Coming back to the COVID situation, one of the real big flaws that COVID has exposed in the national food system is our reliance on a few very large, highly concentrated meat packing facilities, especially in Alberta. And when you get a infectious disease into those facilities, you can immediately threaten the whole meat supply for the whole country. But for years, we've been talking about the need for small scale abattoirs and meat processing facilities in Ontario. There are big parts of this province, especially in the east, where farmers can't get their animals slaughtered. Like the capacity just isn't there. So this is a great, and one of the reasons is because the huge multinational meatpacking companies have helped create regulations that only they have the resources to meet. So I think here's an opportunity, instead of bailing out the huge conglomerates, let's put some public money into upgrading, increasing the capacity of local meat processing facilities in Ontario, so that we are more resilient in the future, that we have a more distributed local system that can weather shocks like this and also can serve the local farming community.
Great, thanks, Brent. So Joshna, you touched on this question a little bit in your opening, so hopefully you can expand. So the question is, how do we shift more money into the local food economy? Can we help local producers sell products online or remove the shelf costs in supermarkets? Are there policy changes that could lead to this?
Yes, the answer is there's lots of things we can do. Obviously, right at the top of my head, the first thing that I would like to see is some public policy, right? I really think that one of the best ways that government can engage with us is around public policy, namely things like mandatory minimum purchasing of local food for public institutions. That would help a lot, right? When I did the math, when I was working at the hospital in Scarborough, in fact, we were standing at Brent and Gil's farm, and that year they were still growing potatoes, right? And they had 4 rows of potatoes, but they couldn't afford nets for all 4, so they could only afford nets for 3, and they lost 1 whole row of potatoes. And the director of food services said to me, she was like, wait, my budget sits in the bank waiting for me to spend it. Why can't I give them the money so they can buy the nets and then they can just bring me potatoes, right? And I started weeping and I hugged her and I was like, that, my friend, is an institutional CSA. And yes, right? Yes. What a sigh of relief for farmers to know that there's the contract, that the money is there, that institutions are purchasing this food. I think that would be a huge win. Right? Institutions get delicious food. Farmers can know that they have a guaranteed market, and we have use for all of our beautiful food, right? That is one piece. The other side of it is that one of the things that I have learned, I mean, look, I'll embarrassingly tell you that I have realized that I live in a bit of a good food bubble, right? I know my people. I'm at the market on Saturday mornings. I know exactly where to get what I need. But I have found myself really helping people out who are trying to find another way to get their food, right? They're not tapped into local sourcing and they don't know who the farms are or where to go to get this kind of stuff. So there, I think, is a lot of opportunity for us, even just in like public education and public knowledge to help people consider what the non-national grocery store option is for their food sourcing, right? Because there's a lot I've discovered. There's a lot of ignorance about it. And I found myself repeatedly saying the same things over again or sending links out to people. And look, the thing is, when they discover that they can get this beautiful food right from a farmer, they feel like they've won some sort of jackpot, right? So in many cases with food, we can set this up so that it is a win-win-win-win situation.
Great, thanks. And so Allison, in your opening, you talked about sort of food security on a national level. And I've always said, if a country can't feed itself, it's just as insecure as a country that can't defend itself. And so this question says, can Canada grow enough and varied enough food to support its population? Is now the right time to bring back more local processing?
Great question. Unfortunately, as long as we want to eat oranges and pineapples and all these things throughout the year, even let's say strawberries, we can grow strawberries, we can't grow them throughout the year. So as much as I would love to say we can't, but certainly we could grow more. Why we still import apples and potatoes, I do not know. Well, I kind of do know. We're competing, with big markets like the States. But I would love to see some of the canning come back. We talked to Mike and I over the time about can grow in Niagara. That was a sin that plant ever closed. And now to start to invest, it takes so much money to start that again. But I would like, again, to build on what everybody said, it's policy of by local, by province, by country. And the Americans are very good in their procurement policy with student nutrition programs or anything like that, that they always push local. And it seems in Canada, we're scared to do that. And to me, that is just a smart thing to do. And growers, we need it. I mean, it's a tough market out there and we're competing globally. And when you do, the majority of produce is sold through those big chains, and boy, do they have the power and they push down, and it's a hard business. So with procurement policy that supported local, that would be great. And increasing processing domestically would be wonderful. And then we would be getting our product, whether it's frozen or canned or pickled, through the industry or through the stores year round. So there's certainly so much more potential to get Canadian product into the market year round, for sure.
Great, thanks. And Wayne, you get the next question. How can municipalities support local food and prevent farms from becoming or being lost to urban sprawl? And can food design be mandated to developers? You're still on mute.
I think one of the big unknowns in Canada is what could municipal governments do if they had a mind to do something powerful and empowering. And so it's the neglected realm of government, and I think it could become a real powerhouse. And that's what I learned in the decade when I was managing the Toronto Food Policy Council. So, and Toronto could be a kingpin to the well-being, for example, of the Greenbelt. So the Greenbelt was, in my opinion, another great move. I think Ontario ranks with Michigan and California as one of the top 3 food producers in the continent. It's got every advantage you can think of, with the exception of winter, right? But Michigan also has winter. But we have great fruit areas, great vegetable areas, great areas for cattle and cows and livestock. And so the reason why we have not become more of a success, I think a big part of it is those farmers haven't been given the infrastructure of the middle, which you'll remember is the big slogan you and Laurie developed at Local Food Plus, to support themselves. Okay, so we can produce strawberries, but we don't have all the facilities to freeze them and store them, and that they have in California. We don't have the huge agricultural schools that they have in every state in the United States. So there's a whole series of infrastructural things that I believe provinces and cities have to do. And one easy starting point is local and sustainable purchasing. You and Laurie started that off at University of Toronto, which is the biggest local and sustainable food purchasing project in North America because of the size of U of T, 90,000 students in the downtown campus. And we could replicate that right through the city of Toronto, that every school would receive a government mandate to buy local and healthy and sustainable food for their kids. We would take a big swath out of the food insecurity problem of children, and we would also support farmers at the same time. That's sort of that New Deal formula, which is find more than one person to benefit, find farmers and children. How do we put these two together? And I think both cities and provinces can do a lot of work to make those kind of partnerships happen.
Great, thanks, Wayne. So Brent, you talked about the important role that seasonal workers play on your farm. And so this question actually directly relates to that is, how do we provide adequate housing for farm workers and others in similar situations, as highlighted by the recent outbreak in Chatham-Kent?
Well, I mean, the regulations that we have in place right now for accommodation for seasonal workers are pretty good. The problem is in enforcement. So we need, in the area that we live in, the enforcement and inspection is pretty rigorous, but it's not consistent across the province, and it's definitely not consistent across the country. So we're actually do a much better job of enforcing the regulations in Ontario than they do in most provinces. But we have to look at some fundamental changes to the way we operate our temporary foreign worker program. I'm very, very proud of the relationship that I have with the men who work on my farm. Some of them have been coming back to work on our farm for almost 10 years. We feel like we pay them well, that we treat them really fairly, and that we've allowed them to really prosper at home, to educate their kids. I have no apologies for the way that we've worked with our employees, but I know that that's not always the case. And there are some serious flaws in the way the program operates. The most important is that it's too easy to send workers home. So if the threat of being sent back to their home country is often enough to prevent workers from being able to stand up and fight for their rights. So we need to allow farm workers to unionize. That's not allowed in Ontario. We need to treat farm workers the way we treat all other workers in this province, and there are certain exemptions from basic labor standards for farm workers that are just don't make any sense. And we need to give temporary workers a path to residency and citizenship if they want it. I think that this crisis has shown how dependent we are on foreign workers, and we need to take care of them and to do right by them so that they're there when we need them. It's going to be a huge disaster for our farming community and for our food system if we run into a situation where we can't get the workers into the country. It's also a huge disaster for them and their families, not being able to get that income. So we have to see this what it is a mutually beneficial relationship. And we need to do right by our temporary workers so that they're going to continue to provide the really essential services that they provide to us.
Great, thanks, Brent. So Joshua, I'm going to give you the next one. How do we break the cycle of industry download of heavily processed foods onto the charitable food security sector?
Great question. This is a really important one, and it's something that we continue to face in my work at the Stop. And the only way that I see this happening, there's two things. One is we need advocacy, right? We, the staff at the Stop and those of us who sort of received food, donations, we had lots of really loud conversations about the fact that dented cans or curiously non-perishable food is not going to be the solution here, right? This is not actually going to work. We actually have to get people perishable food that actually nourishes their bodies. And in my experience working in this sector, the most effective way that I pulled that off was making direct connections with farmers, right? That to me was the best because look, a lot of things were in place because I was a chef and I had the capacity to use whatever came to me, right? I had the skills and the wherewithal and the space to do that. But the other piece was that opened up access to things like number 2s and number 3s and stuff that is not quite ready for market, right? In so much of even my institutional work, in addition to the Stop, my early days, it was like number 2s and 3s apples from Peter Mitchell way back in the day, right? We'll all fondly remember Peter Mitchell and the apples, but that those connections are much better, right? We discover farmers are much happier to sell big, giant volumes of, 2s and 3s produce to a community food organization than just mulch it under or take a loss or, whatever it is. There are ways that grassroots social service community organizations can really make use of whole ingredients. Like, we don't actually have to rely on this really sort of packaged empty calorie stuff, right? And look, the shelves in the food bank at the stop are a testament of exactly that, right? It is a wonderful collection of glorious local food. We use fundraising in a way that supports farmers. Brent and Gil have this incredible Farms for Change program that exactly does this type of thing. And really what it comes down to, as far as I see it, is we have to figure out a way to build a system that actually revalues all of the hands involved in getting food from field to kitchen to table, right? There are levels and levels of exploitation built into that industrial food, and it's really just a dismal showing all around. There is a way for us to rebuild this, for us to get good food into the mouths of hungry people without relying on charity models or donations to make it happen, right? We can be innovative and thoughtful enough about the way we use our money and our connection to really pull this off for everybody.
Great, thanks, Shashank.
Ooh.
Allison, can we incentivize farmers to move towards more sustainable and plant-based production and people to adopt more vegetarian diets to make us food secure?
Well, this is music to my ears from Ontario fruit and vegetable growers that people eat more fruits and vegetables. To me, that's nearly the reverse of what has to be done. Growers will grow what's going to be bought. Growing more produce, if people aren't buying it, is food waste or donations or whatever. So to me, and I'm going to sound really old school here, I think we have to go back to the kids. I've given up on the parents. I'm hitting the kids. It's kind of not literally hitting the kids, going after the kids, just like recycling. They went after the kids. Ontario Fruit and Vegetable Growers is very involved with the Northern Fruit and Veg program. And it's probably year 11 now, and millions of pounds of produce go north, right into fly-in communities and native communities. And when we first started, people said, oh, my kids don't eat fruit and vegetables. And we thought, And, as the kids were exposed to the fruit and vegetables, and nobody fell off their chair after eating broccoli or whatever,
Right, exactly.
they started eating more. And then we saw it coming into the school lunches from home more. So I think getting home ec, however that looks, maybe we call it life skills now, getting school gardens back, getting an awareness of how food is produced and healthy diets with the kids will carry through when they become consumers or drive their parents in their purchasing, that they would be buying. And of course, tie in this with environmental responsibility and a more plant-based diet, all these things that I think when consumers are more informed and they know what to do with the food, then I think that will drive the demand. And that's when the growers can start growing more and selling more. I just think even the basic cooking skills aren't there. Whenever we've, volunteered at the Royal Winter Fair and we've watched, chefs up there doing a great stir fry or whatever, we've had people come to our booths saying, how do you cook a cabbage? What do I do with carrots? So these basic skills, so many people embarrassingly don't have in our society. So I think we have to build on that and create the market for these. And we have the growers in this country to produce the fruits and vegetables.
Great. So before I ask Wayne the next question, I will say I am in one corner of my eye following the chat box. So any of you who may be just participating and want to engage in the conversation in the chat box, it's really a fascinating conversation. And Allison, your comment about teaching food skills clearly has struck a chord.
A good or a bad one? I wasn't looking.
a good one. People are saying we need home economics. We need to teach people how to use food. So
Maybe that's old school saying home ec, but we can call it something else. But
yes, absolutely. So, so Wayne, this is an issue that was near and dear to my heart. Just a few weeks ago, I was working hard on this, so I'm glad somebody asked about it. How can we encourage more community gardens to enable people to access fresh food? And you're on mute, Wayne. It's the challenge of Zoom.
How's that sound?
Good.
Well, thanks for that. And I agree with you, by the way, that all the questions coming along on the side, I'm hoping you're saving them because you could do a fantastic book just answering the, having a Q&A with this. But I think there is a really important role, I think, for a discussion between consumers and farmers of fruits and vegetables to figure out which fruits and vegetables are best grown in farms and on a large scale by professional growers, and which ones are grown at home, so that they're not competing with one another and they're working in tandem. So to my mind, the best advertisement for buying fruits and vegetables from a farmer is to try to grow your own fruits and vegetables, because then you get to appreciate the taste of them, and you also realize how much work goes into it, and you're no longer complaining about the cost of a carrot or a potato after you've done a lot of the hard work on it. So there is a potentially really good relationship, but I think we need some discussion to work it through. I think there is a role for subsistence. I'm actually the only panelist old enough to have been around when the government actually supported home production of food, when they gave all the veterans who came back from World War II a half an acre of land if they wanted it, to be able to grow their own food so they wouldn't go hungry in the event of a recession. There is a role for that. It's good for taste. It's good for family togetherness, good for beautification of the garden, good for wildlife, all sorts of other benefits. And community gardening is partially for people who don't have a backyard or a front yard of their own, and partially for people who like to do things and not be silent while they're growing food, but they want to be chatting with somebody. And significantly, the government shut that down in the first days of the crisis, and we successfully got them to reverse it. They also shut down farmers markets, which we're still working to get them to reverse. Yeah. But there's very little encouragement that's given to either backyard or community gardening. There's nowhere near enough sites. There's huge lineups and waiting lists for them, and a lot of resistance from city government officials to increasing the number. And yet we have enormous amounts of space in order to do that. If we just thought in terms, for example, of flat roofs, 1/6 of the space of most cities is taken up with flat roofs, often in schools and public institutions. And with a fairly modest adaptations, we can be growing food in one way or another on these roofs, and giving everyone an experience of what it tastes like to eat unprocessed, fresh, and delicious fruits and vegetables, which need to be remade as the cornerstone of the diet, and which is 7 to 10 servings a day. And to my mind, you do that, and then everything else falls into place, because there's not that room for, in most people's stomachs, for more than the 7 to 10 servings. So I think we need then a huge support from public health departments to promote eating good food. We need huge support from them and from educators in the public benefits of growing your own food. And we need huge support from governments to give the land and facilities so that people can grow in either backyards or in community gardens.
Great, thanks, Wayne. So this next question, I'm going to throw out to anyone, and it actually comes out of the chat box. So somebody asked, just in response to the conversation we're having, is what are the studies to back up the claims of a connection between poor nutrition and COVID-19?
If you want, by the way, if anyone wants to give me an email, wroberts@gmail.com, I'll send you a list of 10 articles that are on that have just been published in the last 2 months.
Great, thanks, Wayne. I appreciate that. So does anyone else want to say anything on that, or do you want to move to the next question? Okay, I'm going to keep us going then. Oh, here's another one. Actually, you know what? My staff is texting me to help me manage the chat box. And this actually is a good one. So I'm going to ask it. Would a citizens assembly help address gaps in our food system? So you all know what a citizens assembly is. Like, that's basically, we had one in Ontario around reforming our voting system where they randomly selected people from each riding in Ontario, and they met to talk about what our voting system would look like. So I think what this person is asking is, would that type of like citizen engagement help address gaps in the food system? Yeah, go ahead, Allison.
Well, I'm going to sound kind of old and jaded here, but I mean, I can go back 15 years with Debbie Field from Food Share, Lori Nickel, all of us going to Ottawa, to the Hill, to talk just what we're talking about today. And they'd all nod and go, yes, that's, apple pie and motherhood. And there just was never, no pun intended, but the appetite, it just never seemed a priority. I'm hoping, again, not wasting a crisis, that now people are realizing that food security is a priority, and the whole food system needs to be re-examined. And I think now is the time to go after this, or maybe a little bit when the dust settles. But it's not through lack of trying with industry, with different stakeholders. I'll let other people weigh in too, but efforts have been going on for years and years and years, exactly what we're all talking about.
Great. Does anyone else want to chime in? Yeah, go ahead, Joshua.
I will agree with Allison, although at my heart, the notion of the voice of the people always feels important, but we have no shortage of grassroots coalitions of people in this country, right? In this province, in this town. It's the fact that we keep screaming, but it's not landing anywhere, right? That seems to be the bigger challenge, is that it's not landing anywhere. And so while I don't like the idea of discouraging people gathering, in a grassroots way to figure out, to advocate for themselves and their food system, I think that we need to look around and see that those coalitions in fact already exist. Right? And it's about, how do we amplify that? How do we join those efforts and scream and yell a bit louder so that the people who really have the power to be helpful here start listening?
I've actually had two experiences of assemblies, which I think worked out really well. And that was when Toronto was forced into amalgamation. The city decided, well, rather than fight it and just mobilize negative energy, let's react and say, well, what can we do? And they set up a number of citizens input groups. One was the Food and Hunger Action Committee that went for well over 2 years. And we got fantastic buy-in from the public and enormous consensus. And the Toronto Food Charter, for example, came out of that process. And it was supported by right, left, and center, which is really important to get things to move. And the proposal, it was well-staffed and staffed by very knowledgeable people. And also people came out and just spoke from the heart or from studies that they'd done. And we got a really high quality. And the second experience I had was in 2009, the medical officer of health set up a food strategy. And again, we went to the public to get ideas. And again, they were of a very high quality. So I do want to see participation by nonprofits and by all the vested interests or interest groups that are involved in it, and by health authorities. But there is a place for just the citizen as a citizen to participate actively in this.
Mike, could I add?
Yeah, go ahead, Allison. Yep.
Yeah, I agree with everybody, what everybody's saying. And just part of the lobbyist in me, there's always the so what factor. And I'll say, government, this all sounds great, so what? But I think now we have to pivot, and the so what is well-fed children learn better, and you will have a more employable person and taxpayer. Healthier people, well-fed people will be healthier people and cost the government less money in the healthcare system. So I think we're all right, but I think we have to just turn it nearly 180 and tell municipalities, schools, Ministry of Health, all these people why they should care. It'll save them money in the long run. And money talks in this, unfortunately. What we're all saying is right and comes from the heart and the brain. But when you're speaking with government, I think there's also that other side of it's a no-brainer to all of us, but we have to explain it to them.
Mhm.
And Mike,
Go ahead, Brent.
I think we have to remember that there are also people arguing on the other side of this argument, right? That we have the food system we have today because there are powerful interests that want this kind of food system, and who benefit from it. So whatever we do, whether it's a citizens assembly or the kind of coalitions that Wayne's talking about, we have to use the power of our numbers and the power of our argument to force the issue with government. When we launched Farmers for Climate Solutions in February, we launched on National Agriculture Day. And on National Agriculture Day, they had a ceremony in Ottawa with the Minister of Agriculture and a bunch of speakers. And the speakers were representatives from McDonald's Canada, from Syngenta, the largest chemical input or pesticide manufacturer in the world, from Bayer, which now owns Monsanto. There were from Maple Leaf Foods. There were, you'd think that there'd be farmers on speaking at National Agriculture Day, but what there were representatives of giant multinational food and chemical companies. So these are the people who have the ear of government. These are the people who spend the money to have the lobbyists on the Hill. And unless we get together and force the issue, then things aren't going to change.
So before I ask well said, before I ask the final question, I'm going to take as the moderator and ask a question that I've been struggling with in my entire food career. Is on the one hand, we want people to have access to healthy local food. And oftentimes the cost of that food tends to be higher than what comes out of, an imported or more industrial food system. And so we also want people to have affordable access to food as well. We have a lot of people struggling and challenging to be able to afford to put food on their table. And so how do we begin to create a food system that both is profitable for farmers, so farmers can make a good living, but also supplies affordable food for people that's healthy? And how do we bridge that challenge? Anybody you want to take that? Go for it, Allison.
I'm going to go back to home ec. And I don't know how many times in our household we laugh at how cheap some of the meals are. When you know how to cook, when things are in season or something's on sale, or, our joke in our house, is about zucchini. If you've got to buy zucchini, you mustn't have any friends, because everybody around us is always giving us tomato and zucchini, even though we grow it ourselves. But when you know how to grow a garden, or even just know how to cook, whether it's cooking, beans, or getting a roast on sale and all the meals you get from that, whatever, I think you can feed a family well when you have those skills of cooking from scratch and not buying processed packaged food. And that's my shtick, is the home ec side and cooking skills.
Yeah, go ahead, Josh. Yeah.
For sure, I agree with Allison. The skills, rice and beans are cheap, right? Carrots, potatoes, onions are very affordable. But if you don't know what to do with them, it all kind of falls apart. But it also needs to be mentioned that we do have to address social assistance. Yeah. Right? We do. There's just no question. A lot of your food budget is your first expendable budget. You can't pay half your rent, even though maybe the last couple of months are proving differently. Maybe there are some people who in fact have paid half their rent. But generally speaking, the first bit of flexibility you have is with your food budget. And we know there are many, many studies. The folks at Proof at U of T with Val Tarasuk have shown us that when people just need more money to be able to buy good food. right? And that really is the bottom line. And we can get really innovative with programs and, you know what I mean, and networks and co-ops. We can do all those sorts of things. But if people don't have the money to invest to spend, and both from social assistance and working people with jobs to make decisions about how they're going to spend their money too, right? This is from many directions. This is a government piece, but the spirit of this whole conversation is really about revaluing our food and being willing to offer up more of our time, our money, and our effort towards getting it on the table.
Well, I think maybe the challenge of a good policy is that you have to get a balance between empowering and enabling. And so, and I think too many people put too much emphasis on the empowering. Well, you know what, you got to learn how to cook and start off from the beginning, but you also have to, the government needs to enable people. Like, for example, a very obvious thing, Quebec has taken the lead on this, which is that they consider it a child's right to grow up free of commercialization. So they do not allow advertising on the media on any kind of food ads that are targeted to children under 12 years of age, for the simple reason that children under the age of 12 cannot make up a rational decision in response to that ad. So as a matter of children's rights, they don't allow advertising for good food or bad food. So they allow that to be an issue for the family and the community to decide on what's the proper food. So we need a whole series of protections for the public that government needs to use the force of law to establish. And then we need mechanisms that can empower families and individuals. And that includes adequate income that gives you the power to and enables you to purchase the foods that you know you need.
Great.
I think it's also important to remember that we in Canada have the cheapest food of any civilization in the history of the world. So if we have we live in a very prosperous province with incredibly cheap food, and we still have people who can't afford to buy good food. That's not a cost of food problem, that's an income problem. The other thing that Josh has said this really eloquently a lot of times in the past, there's no such thing as cheap food. You know, if you're buying cheap food, the cost of that food is being paid by the farmer who's not being paid enough, by the farm worker who's not getting paid enough and working in bad conditions, by the environment, by the climate. Somebody's paying for that cheap food that you're buying if it's not you. So we have to get used to the fact that we need to pay more for our food. It's a simple fact, and we have to find ways to make sure that everybody in our society can afford good food.
Great. So I'm going to go into our final question, even though there's a lot of great questions coming at me. But I want to give ourselves time to give each of you time to answer this one, and also for Ralph to do the wrap up. And so imagine that I'm Doug Ford and not Mike Schreiner. So you're talking to the premier, not just this MPP from Guelph. But and maybe let's do reverse. We'll start with Brent and we'll go reverse order again. Is how should Ontario improve its food security using the lessons from COVID-19? And so if you could just imagine, you're talking to Doug Ford or Ernie Hardeman, who's the Minister of Agriculture. In some respects, what would an Ontario food strategy look like post-COVID?
I'm going to come at this from a farmer perspective, and I think the post-COVID priority has to be resilience. That we have to have a food system that's resilient to economic shocks. So we have shorter supply chains. We have more direct-to-consumer sales. We have more local processing and preserving capacity. All the things we've talked about in this discussion, and we have to have a food system that's resilient to climate shocks. And that means putting a really, really strong emphasis on soil health on farms, on building healthy living soils, on having increased biodiversity in agricultural lands, more trees on agricultural lands, all of the things that we know that both reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, that help sequester carbon in soils, and reduce CO2 levels in the atmosphere, make farms more resilient to weather shocks, and also make more farms more profitable, because underlying all of these problems we see in agriculture is a profitability crisis for farmers. So the really encouraging thing for me is that the kind of practices that we're talking about serve all of these goals of making farms more profitable, more climate resilient, and also mitigating climate change. So to me, that's in a nutshell the kind of agricultural system, at least, we need to build after this crisis.
So I know I'm not supposed to ask questions, but I want to ask you a quick one, Brent, related to that, because part of it came up in the chat too, is do you think farmers should be paid for storing carbon?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's going to be a challenge to figure out exactly the technicalities of how to do it, but I think that there's a huge potential for storing atmospheric carbon in agricultural soils. And I think that there are mechanisms to measure it and to pay farmers to do that. And I think absolutely that's the way to go.
Great, thanks. So Joshna, your chance to tell Premier Ford through MPP Schreiner how Ontario can improve its food security moving forward, learning from the lessons of COVID-19.
Yes, exciting. I've been hoping that at some point I'd ever get that chance. One of the things that I really want to see is more of an investment in an emergency plan, right? We've really, and particularly I would like to see chefs and farmers involved in that conversation more, right? I spent a lot of time obviously talking to my chef colleagues, and it would be like we've all kind of scrambled to put things together, and I think we've done a marvelous job, but wouldn't it be great if we had a plan where the minute the Premier calls state of emergency in the province, there's a network of us chefs who know exactly what this pivot looks like. This person's baking all the bread. This person is gonna make soups. We're all gonna condense these kitchens, and the money comes through from government to chefs who, you know what I mean? Restaurants have to close, whatever it is. But this system, we need to invest in this plan B of a system, because there are tidy ways, right? Governor of California has put this together, and he is mobilizing dormant restaurants to produce food that, you know, can go to seniors and healthcare workers and vulnerable people. That is exactly the kind of thing that we need to see, and we need resources and organization from government to do it, right? We are all working really hard on the ground to put our networks together, but it would be wonderful if we had resources to actually formalize these plans so that the next time a state of emergency is called, we know exactly what we have to do, right? And we can mobilize and really take care of people, because we see right now, we're sitting with this scenario with chefs sitting at home and nothing to do and mountains of potatoes, right, that haven't been sold. Why are there not systems that can automatically start pairing those two, those up? That is the kind of thing that I want to see, because that is also, I think, where resilience is gonna grow anyhow.
No, it's interesting you say that, because a lot of people came to me when the news that milk was being dumped, and they were like, "If you do something about this." And my response was, it's very hard to shift supply chains that quickly.
Exactly.
So all that milk was going to Tim Hortons and Starbucks. And
precisely.
You couldn't shift it to retail fast enough. Yeah.
That's it. But if we had a plan, then maybe we could, right? We could figure out a way, because those lattes still need to be made somehow, right?
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Allison, your chance to. You get to lobby the Premier probably more than any other panelist, but so here's your chance to maybe lobby the NDP for Guelph. What do you think? How should Ontario improve its food security, learning the lessons from this COVID-19 crisis?
Well, I can only speak for the fruit and vegetable industry, edible hort, but for us, and it'll build on what everybody said before, especially Brent. But margins are single digit, input costs keep rising, we're labor intensive. The majority of fruit and veg goes through these consolidated chains. I mean, that is the reality of our food system. I mean, right now, even we were meeting with Ernie Hardeman today, pushing that you pick operations are included inessential and can be open. We're going to be hearing that golf courses can open shortly, and we're still fighting until about a few hours ago that U-Pick operations can open. This is how idiotic things are, but I'm already getting sidetracked here. We need to create a food system that's financially viable for farmers to grow fruits and vegetables in Ontario. And what really irks me is that during our in season, we see lost leaders at these big chains. A bag of potatoes should never be $2.99. This perpetuates this culture of cheap food. I'd like to see, Mr. Ford, more fruit and vegetable processing come back to Ontario, and maybe that can of peaches or those jar of pickles are going to be 25 cents more. But this race to the bottom for cheap food is doing us a great disservice. I would like the chains to be encouraged by the government. I mean, these are private companies, but encouraged that they buy local first. And I would like to see the chains be encouraged by the government to be respectful of payment terms for growers. Just last season, we were battling the chains that they were pushing up to 90-day terms to pay growers for perishable products. And I mean, it's a dynamic of where the power is, right? But that head of broccoli is either sold or rotted well before 90 days. So this is a very unhealthy dynamic. I would like to see Ontario and Canadian citizens and government understand that food security isn't just a local issue, it also is a national security issue. And as I said earlier, I think that we can't waste this crisis. We have to double down on what we can grow here in Ontario and in Canada and what we can process. And we need provincial and federal food policies that support, that create this culture that it is a national security issue, and it's a local issue, it's municipal, it's provincial, it's federal, and we have to be strategic, midterm, and long-term for this. So that is my pitch to the Premier.
Great, Allison. I'll make sure I deliver it.
Thank you, Mike.
Wayne, you get to be the final panelist. So what would you tell the Premier? What would be your recommendations for how we can improve food security, learning the lessons we have from this COVID crisis?
Well, I think I tried three pitches. First, we need to establish New Deal kind of thinking. And the essence of New Deal thinking is find two beneficiaries. So the example that Allison just gave, let's help seniors by providing them with fresh food from local farms through unemployed restaurant workers and unemployed farmers. And then we have three groups that benefit from it. So let's use that way of thinking instead of thinking in terms of siloed departments that are only thinking of the interest group that they're in charge of. So the first is to think in a New Deal kind of way. Second is to localize, and I'm going to pin up on my Twitter an article about all the new things the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN has come out with in the last month and a half. And the key one is they say we need to localize food economies. That's the big lesson of this crisis. So I want to emphasize that. And then third, along with Brent and others, to say we pay farmers for goods and we have to modernize that and pay them for goods and services. And one of the services they can provide is to protect the environment. And a big one of them is to put more carbon in the soil and less in the atmosphere. And we should pay them to do it just like we pay them for goods.
Great. Well, I'm happy that to have more than one of you say we should pay farmers for environmental goods and services, because it's something that I advocate all the time at Queen's Park. And so I will definitely continue to deliver that message. So I just want to ask Ralph, I want to first of all just thank our four panelists for an excellent discussion and for bringing your expertise and your perspective to the table. And I'd like to just invite Ralph Martin, professor from University of Guelph, author of Food Security, to just do some parting comments and a wrap up of what you heard from tonight's discussion and how we move forward.
Okay, well, happy to do this, Mike. I just want you to know that I've been having a great time. I've been taking lots of notes. I'm an academic and I've got 5 minutes. So feel free to pull out the plank and send me to the Zoom netherworld if I go a bit too long. I thought it was really interesting that everybody said we need food awareness and advocacy. On the Citizens Assembly idea, Wayne pointed out the Toronto Food Charter came out of a Citizens Assembly. And then going to local processing and local markets. And I think if we're going to look at, I've got 9 main points. We talked about they have to have appropriate regulations for small producers. Granted, we need food safety, but with abattoirs and so on, they could be much more localized. We've got the Ontario Food Terminal, which is great. We've got supply management. We have a nimble local organic food system. And Brent gave the example of pivoting from supplying restaurants to consumers. Allison pointed out we need more local canning processors. And then she was banging home the point about home economics. And I really agree with you on that one, Allison. And people need to know why to buy local fruits and vegetables and how to prepare and process them at home. One of the other things that I think is really key to food security is affordable rural internet as a basic infrastructure. I know this wasn't mentioned, but I just want to take the opportunity here to mention that because that leads to connectivity and it's often an issue in rural areas. And then the third one is a plan to pay farmers for sequestering carbon. And as we just pointed out, that's a service. It's important, as Brent pointed out, to be resilient to climate shocks. The climate crisis is a big issue now, and it certainly will be in the future. And we can deal with this partly with regenerative agriculture, perennial forages, permaculture. I have a few more ideas about that, but I'll go on to the next point. I think it's really important to protect classes 1, 2, and 3 farmland and wetlands. And this came up in as much as Wayne talked about Toronto could be a kingpin for the Greenbelt, where class 1, 2, and 3 land and wetlands are protected. And he talked about needing infrastructure of the middle. I'd just like to push an idea that I have been for a while is that I think we need more like a green blob program than a green belt. So that is wherever there are blobs of class 1, 2, and 3 farmland or wetlands in Ontario, these areas or these blobs are automatically protected from development. We need to protect class 1, 2, and 3 farmland and wetlands across the province. Number 5 is recognition that hunger is caused by poverty. It's not a food supply problem, it's a poverty problem. And it's been mentioned that some people are dismissive of the social safety net. We need to relieve poverty. The basic income guarantee or a universal basic income would be a good answer to this, I think. Val Tarasuk, as I think Joshna mentioned at U of T, shows that people need money to buy food. And Wayne talked about enabling people, an example, the right to grow up free from commercialization. And we want to make healthy food available to low-income people in Ontario and thus save on healthcare costs. And there was talk about access to urban land and flat roofs for gardens. And then people would grow and appreciate the taste of fresh fruits and vegetables. My 6th point is healthy food. Several mentioned that in a crisis, those with poor nutrition are more vulnerable to COVID. Wayne said he has papers about that, wroberts@gmail.com. So if you want to get information from him, you can. Public institutions buy healthy local food. This would be a good way to get more healthy food to people. Direct connections to farmers is really important. And then you have access to number 2s and number 3s. I think it would be important to pass the Organic Products Act to get more healthy food in Ontario. Just like to mention, this didn't come up so much about meat and so on, but I think it's really important as number 7 to think about having food for people and feed for livestock. And then there are many synergies that we can get from that. As number 8, I'd like to mention wasted food, and it's possible that it didn't come up just because it wasn't directly asked, but it's really important to do this through the value chain And this could also be a key part of the basic curriculum in schools. And then temporary foreign workers, to some extent, that might be a federal issue, but there are things we can do in Ontario. Standards for housing, for example, it's a problem of enforcement, as Brent mentioned, and we have to make sure that, or he's suggesting too, that it would be good to allow these temporary foreign workers to unionize. So I'll stop there, but I had a lot of fun with this. Thank you very much.
Great, Ralph. That was a great summation. And I just want to close by thanking all four panelists and Ralph once again. Excellent discussion. I think Ontario is lucky to have people like ourselves who are so actively engaged in our food system. And I want to thank you for that. And I want to thank everyone who were a part of the conversation tonight. It's interesting. I always watch how many people you retain, and almost everybody is still on the line. So a few people have dropped off, but it just shows you how engaged I think the public is in this issue. And so I want to thank all of you for the amazing conversation that we've had in the chat box. And we will save that and use that to inform our own policy decisions and the work that I do at Queen's Park. And I finally just want to thank my amazing staff, because it is, one person cannot pull this off. It takes an entire team to be able to manage this. And I'm really lucky to have a fantastic staff. And a lot of people say I punch above my weight at Queen's Park. And it's only because I have an amazing team of people to support me and help me. So thank you, everyone. Be safe, be well, and keep supporting local farmers through the food that you eat every single day. Bye and good night.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing, Mike.
Yeah, thank you.